Historians write how some members of the Nemanjic dynasty were great sinners, how brother betrayed brother, and brother fought against brother, how father assaulted son, and son father. This is not untrue, but it is untrue that this and this alone was the whole story of their life, that this is their entire biography. These historians relate the account up to a certain point, but not to the end. It is as though St. Luke, the historian of the Acts of the Apostles, had related how Saul fiercely persecuted the Christians, and then stopped and ended his account without relating the rest of the story, i.e., how Saul turned into Paul, the persecutor into the apostle, the sinner into the penitent, the enemy of Christ into the saint. Truly, some members of the Nemanjic dynasty, being human, did sin through human weakness, but they repented for their sins and ended their lives as penitents. We do not know whether Vukan ever repented, and thus he has remained off the church calendar, bereft of glory, for he rose up against his two saintly brothers, Sava and Stephen, and joined the Roman Church. Consequently, he has been characterized as a traitor, or as the prototype of all Serbian traitors, and always with the same name: Vukan, Vuk, Vukasin, Vujika. Nevertheless, King Dragutin repented for his revolt against his brother, King Milutin, and became a monk, and as a monk with the name Teoctist, wrapped himself in chains as penance to repent. He also constructed several marvelous churches to the glory of God, such as Ozren, Tvana, Raka, Lozinka, and the church at Aurelia. He even became a saint. Why do modern Serbian historians not relate the account to its conclusion? As the Serbian people say, Kraj delo krasi. This conclusion adorns the work. King Milutin also repented for his sin against his son Stephen, and bitterly wept for his sin before the abbot of Pantocrator Monastery, where the blinded Stephen had been confined. Milutin also became a saint, not as a sinner, but as a penitent, and not as a penitent in word alone, but also in deed, serving Christ as Lord to the end of his long life. None of the modern Serbian historians discuss what is most momentous and most important in regard to the personality of this glorious king, namely, that he became a saint and that the Bulgarian capital city of Sofia preserves his body as its greatest relic. These modern historians fail to see that because unchristian and non-Serbian darkness has clouded their spiritual vision, they do not forgive the sin of one whom God has forgiven and made a saint as well. The history of the Serbian people cannot be written with polish alone, but with blood and tears from the heart. Tsar Dusan also repented for his sin against his father, Stefan Dukansky, but the sin of a son against his father is more grievous than the sin of a brother against a brother, or of a father against a son. Dusan has remained great and glorious, but he did not become a saint, i.e., he attained the highest glory on earth, but did not attain the highest glory in heaven. But even though he did not become a saint, we believe that God forgave his sin because of his enormous and untiring service to God. For he was penitent, and he built many ecclesiastical foundations, performed countless works of mercy, safeguarded monasteries and all justice through his strict laws. He made the monasteries of the holy mountain of Athos strong and secure, defended the whole Christian Balkans from the infidels, and perished in the crusade for Christianity in the Balkans. Truly, even if during his youth he did commit a great sin against his father, he was a radiant and faithful servant of Christ to the end of his life in deed and in suffering, always signing his name as a slave of Christ God, and sacrificing himself for the venerable cross and the golden freedom of all the Christian peoples of the Balkans. George Brankovic also repented for the sins of his father Vuk, the traitor of Kosovo, but it is difficult to accept his repentance in behalf of the sinner, whom the people, as the living Church of Christ, the living Church of God, have never forgiven. Nevertheless, the despot George was justified in the sight of God and his people on account of his deeds and sufferings. True, he did not become a saint, but his deeds in the service of Christ our God were great. He built churches, kept the Orthodox faith strictly, rejected a papal overture to convert the Roman Church, lavishly endowed the monasteries in Serbia and on the holy mountain of Athos, wisely and carefully protected his people to the extent that he could as a Turkish vassal, and as a parent he endured terrible sufferings on account of the misfortune of his children, for his 2 sons were blinded by the Turks, and his daughter was compelled to marry the bloodthirsty Sultan. Yet even though George did not become a saint, several of his descendants through Mother Angelina did, and George was a slave of Christ God in deed and in suffering, and remained so until the end of his life. Prince Miloš Obrenović also repented for his sin against Karageorge, because he was indirectly involved in the death of the great leader, who was moreover his cum. The monastery church called Pokjanka Repentance, which Miloš had built at Radovanja, testifies to his penitence. But there is more to Miloš than his repentance for this sin. He considered himself a servant of God and his people. He fought for the venerable cross and suffered much from others as well as from his own kindred. He renovated nearly all the ruined monasteries, not only in the liberated portion of Serbia, but in unliberated Serbia as well, all the way to Jovan Bigorski. He used to fast, keep his Krasnoslava, and pray to God often, just as the great Karageorge did. Like all the Serbian rulers of old and the entire Serbian people, they were men of the people both in their blood and in their soul. Yet whoever served Christ God with such holiness and righteousness as that amazing Lazar of Kosovo, not only was he canonized a saint, but his wife, the Tsaritsa Milica, and his son, Stefan Vizovki, Stephen the Tall, were canonized as well, a vine sprung from a holy root. He performed all the works pleasing to God, like the members of the Nemanjic dynasty, and ruled, or more accurately, served, in times more difficult than the times of the Nemanjic dynasty. He built many ecclesiastical foundations, of which Rvanica, Lazarica, and Gornjak are still in use today. He renovated the monastery of St. Roman from its ruins. He was a great benefactor of the holy places on the holy mountain of Athos. He made a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre, Christ's tomb. He was a father to orphans and a protector of the destitute. And above all, he laid down his life on the field of Kosovo for the venerable cross and the golden freedom. For this the Serbian people have cherished him and praised him in verse, and God has glorified him by making him a saint and crowning him with a double crown, as his servant and as his martyr. We have cited here only a few examples of Serbian rulers and nobles, describing how they walked in the path of Nemanja and Saba, considering themselves the first servants of Christ our God before their people. But we have not even come close to listing them all. There were hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even thousands more minor princes, leaders, military governors, and nobles who trod this same path, and prepared themselves during this life for the life to come like servants of Christ. Through their service, founding churches, making various sacrifices, and suffering many hardships on earth, they looked with hope to the eternal and immortal heavenly kingdom. Who will list them all? No one has ever listed them. Every region, not only of the Serbian land, but of the whole of the Balkans, from Bessarabia to Constantinople, from one see to the other, preserves a stone memorial to them, i.e., their names engraved in the walls or their faces preserved in the frescoes of their ecclesiastical foundations. Where are the ecclesiastical foundations of neighboring peoples on Serbian soil? Pose this question to yourself 3 times, Serbian brother, and ponder it. The answer: there is not one anywhere. There is not one remaining ecclesiastical foundation in the border region. The Bukovo monastery in the vicinity of Negotin is not a foundation of Romanian nobles, but of that glorious Serbian king Milutin. There's no Bulgarian foundation in Macedonia, and no Greek foundation anywhere. Even though the Patriarchate of Constantinople has had jurisdiction over the Serbian people for a long period up to the time of St. Sava, and for a long period of time during the time of the Turks, there's no Greek ecclesiastical foundations anywhere. Not one by Greek rulers or bishops or nobles. Truly unbelievable, but true. And although the Bulgarians lay claim to Macedonia and Thrace, nowhere in these lands do we see any ecclesiastical foundations of Bulgarian rulers. Nevertheless, Greek Thessaly and all the environs of the Bulgarian capital are adorned with holy churches built by Serbian founders. By this we do not mean to reproach or belittle our neighbors. Such is their upbringing. They had no Nemanja or St. Sava, and were not brought up as Serbs in one straight direction, the Thirula, in service to God and at the supreme aim of human life on earth. Along with their unprecedented maxim for their venerable cross and golden freedom. Therefore, even the leaders of those peoples were no less wealthy than the Serbian rulers. They remained indifferent with respect to serving God and did not spend their treasure on ecclesiastical foundations. They regarded earth and not heaven. They were concerned with the earthly kingdom and not the heavenly. Therefore, they very often lost both. Only some of the Romanian military governors were ecclesiastical founders, but even this was due to the influence of their Serbian wives, their Serbian sons-in-law, or members of the Serbian aristocracy who were refugees in Romania. Serbian patriotism is universally Christian, never narrow and crass chauvinism. Thus could one define the Serbian patriotism of St. Sava to put his own household in order with the rest of his strength and resources to help every people to put his house in order, or to serve Christ and his God in his own land and in the land of his fathers, and insofar as he was able with the remainder to serve Christ his God in other lands also, both near and far, all the ways to Russia and Mount Sinai, and even to the ends of the inhabited world. Christian patriotism in universality and universality in Christian patriotism. The Serbs alone are bearers of this ideal, even to this day realized in large part, and along with the Serbs, only the Russians among this members of the Orthodox family of peoples on earth. Is there anything more salutary for the whole world? We feel that, for now, we have sufficiently discussed how the leaders of the Serbian people, be they kings or czars or despots or commanders or military governors, served Christ their God from their thrones and seats of power. As founders of churches, monasteries, as defenders of the Orthodox faith, as helpers in defense of neighboring peoples, as protectors of the poor, and as cross-bearing warriors against the infidels. Let us now move on to monasticism as the ultimate and supreme degree of service to Christ our God. As the final examination for all those who have prepared themselves with years of training in that very service in various ways. Monasticism among the Serbs is a tremendous historical reality, which played a greater role in Serbian history than church founding, because a founder gives what is his, but a monk gives himself to the service of God. In this sense, monasticism is greater than church founding. The example of the old Nemanja and the example of the young Rasko had a contagious effect, and even today influences old and young Serbs to abandon everything, choose the heavenly kingdom, and set out on the narrow and thorny path, the path of monastic struggle. Actually, in Serbian history, the monk occupies a position higher than any other calling or title, not because of any external authority, but because of his moral significance. In the lectionary of the Orthodox Church, one hears about someone who had a vision in which he saw monks above the Emperor Constantine in the heavenly world. From time immemorial, members of the Serbian aristocracy would withdraw from this world into monasteries and the wilderness as much as the common people. The Serbian Saint Petka, the Venerable Mother Paraskiva, was of noble birth. That trinity of glorious spiritual fathers, Saint Procorius of Psinia, Saint Gavril Gabriel of Lesnovo, and Saint John of Rila, were also of aristocratic and distinguished birth. They lived long before Nemanja and Sava and served the Lord. But service to the Lord by this monastic path, in majestic style, with great zeal, began with those two extraordinary men who ushered in all that is great in the history of the Serbian people. The mighty Nemanja became a monk, and so did his son Prince Rastko, and then King Stephen, and the first crowned, King Vladislav, King Uroš, Prince Predislav, later called Sava II, King Dragutin, and so did the half-brothers of the Tsar Dusan, and Anna, Nemanja's wife, became a nun, as did Queen Yelena of Gradec, Helen, the sister of King Stephen Dekanski, Tsaritsa Helen and the wife of Tsar Dusan, Tsaritsa Militsa and Despotitsa Euphemia and Mother Angelina, and Maxim, her son, embraced the monastic life, along with many more members of the House of Brankovic, at Srem, Erdile, and in Romania. After the Battle of Kosovo, many Serbian nobles withdrew to the holy mountain of Athos and ended their lives there as monks. Just as many of them filled the Serbian and Greek monasteries in Palestine. Even the monastery on Mount Sinai in Egypt had Serbian monks. These members of the Serbian aristocracy did not withdraw from the world into the monastery to save their earthly life from death, who of those born ever succeeded in that. Rather, they did so to attain eternal life by serving Christ their God. Nor did they go off to the monasteries to be fed and supported. By no means. On the contrary, they brought with them into the monasteries their wealth intact, and everywhere they were fondly remembered for building and renovating monasteries, painting icons, and copying books. Everywhere they labored with the renowned spirit of a Serbian household master. Nowhere on the holy mountain of Athos, or in the East, did a Serbian monk eat the bread of others idly or die without merit or good reputation. Even to the present day, Serbian monks are remembered in the monasteries of Jerusalem for their goodness, and in some places the work of their hands is still to be seen. They serve God and not themselves, and God bless their memory even in distant foreign lands. Through monasticism and martyrdom for the faith, the Serbian aristocracy sealed their sincere service and their complete choice of the heavenly kingdom, the unchangeable and eternal reality. What is monasticism except the voluntary martyrdom of the self for the sake of the highest aim of life, as the Savior proclaimed it? The Serbian nobles used to make the decision in favor of this martyrdom of self easily, since they had the example of Nemanja and Sava before them. The elderly followed the example of the old Nemanja, and the youth the example of Sava. It is certain that no other Orthodox people has had so many rulers voluntarily descend the throne and withdraw to monasteries to serve Christ as simple monks through monastic struggle. Truly in this, the Serbs hold first place before the whole of Christendom. Thus was the design of the Zika monastery. The design of Sava carried out over the centuries equally by the leaders of the church and the leaders of the state. Both the former and the latter used to consider themselves servants of God. Both used to regard service to God as their holy duty and only duty, and by serving God to their last breath, both hoped to obtain the heavenly kingdom. The ox on the right, the ox on the left, peacefully bore their yoke and served their master. Church and state were a single, unified, and indivisible organism of the people. The conflict between church and state had always produced heretics and atheists. After the Bogomils died out, there was never any heresy among the Serbian people, and not a single atheist was to be found from the time of Nemanja until the time of Milan Obrenović, until the most recent times when we, as a free people, turned our face to the streets of Western Europe and looked into the face of this hemisphere brooding ill for the world, and of this hemisphere deformed by heresy and atheism. From that time we began to bode ill for ourselves. The new Serbian aristocracy, the so-called intelligentsia, became charmed with Europe as the supreme good. The intellectuals became foreigners, and with their whole soul they set themselves apart from their people and the direct course of their people's history. Although they used to pharisaically babble about the people and the people's rights, and by word and pen and deed they turned the people away from the heavenly kingdom and riveted its soul to the earthly treasure and motley ashes of this passing world. Every member of the intelligentsia was ready to boast of his service in the palace, or the government, or the university, but not one was ready to boast of his service to Christ our God. This was the beginning of the most recent and fearful tragedy of the Serbian people. The old Serbian aristocracy, if one can speak of the Serbian aristocracy in general, used to sin, even though it was an aristocracy that served God. But whenever they did sin, they could always turn to God and say the well-known prayerful words, "Lord, even though I have sinned, I have not departed from thee." Sometimes they did yield to sin, but they never let go of the lifeline of salvation. They repented, made voluntary amends for their sins, and were saved. The more recent Serbian aristocracy, the members of the so-called intelligentsia, are drowning men who have departed from Christ our God, and thus they continue to drown because they have let go of the lifeline of salvation from their hands. O meek Jesus, Son of God before the ages, thou still descend from heaven and from thine own throne into the fearful wilderness of this black world, where even the sun could be extinguished by fear, as a monk and a hermit to cultivate fields, and to fill a dry, dead sea with living water. Rulers looked upon the Lord and came to know him. They considered this life as fleeting as water, and so they gave up their thrones and did so with joy. After thine example, they set out as a flock to plow themselves in the peace of the wilderness, and to grow the seed that they had borrowed from thee, so that by prayer and fasting and nightly vigils they might make themselves like unto mighty angels, who daily and nightly, with neither fear nor grief, gaze attentively upon their own Creator. The marvel of marvels, source of all mysteries, the three in one, most radiant in countenance. And our fathers made their decision, and thus chose to serve their Maker as monks in monasteries, to behold the miraculous and breathed glory, the only true, eternal, unfading glory. Glory more pleasant than all the pleasures in the world, and sweeter by far than all vanities that fade. Whatever we have said about the Serbian state and the civil leaders, about their Saint Savian concept of life as service to Christ our God, and about the various ways in which they perform this service, applies even more fully to the leaders of the Church of the Serbian people, to its archbishops, patriarchs, monks, and priests. Both to those in authority and the common people, they were interpreters of the gospel as service to God, both by word and example. Many of them were founders and benefactors, and all were defenders of the true faith from heresy, protectors of the people and nourishers of the poor, chroniclers of Serbian history, and inspirers of minstrels and bards. The holy mountain of Athos was their first spiritual hearth. Jerusalem was their second. Both on the holy mountain and in the Holy Land, they were instructed in Theodulia, service to God, so that after they received instruction through practice and training, not through mere words, they might convey it to their people, or else they remained there to serve God in domestic and foreign monasteries as members of those brotherhoods, and reposed in the Lord as servants of the Lord, on Mount Carmel, on Mount Tabor, by the river Jordan, in Jerusalem, or its environs, or on Mount Sinai. During the period of Turkish rule, they founded their own monasteries and built ecclesiastical foundations all over the Pannonia, across Hungary, all the way to the Carpathian Mountains, all over Romania, and throughout southern Russia. This especially took place when Branković ruled as despot, and the Patriarch was transferring his see from Pec to Austro-Hungary. And so these Serbian patriarchs, as well as the bishops of Montenegro, were martyr servants of Christ our God. Through necessity and force of circumstance, they bore on their backs a concern for the people and the people's affairs without wielding any worldly authority over the people like Roman clericalists. As a consequence, one will not find in the histories of the Serbian people any mention of theocracy during that bitter period when the patriarchs of Pec and the bishops of Montenegro stood at the head of their people, for there is no theocracy of any sort, but only fervent Theodulia, service to God. A free state no longer existed. There remained only the church. The secular leaders were gone. There remained only the spiritual leaders. One ox had been slain, and the other was left to bear the yoke alone and pull the whole cart. From time, immemorial nations have looked to their leaders and emulated them. The Serbian people looked to their rulers and leaders, to their bishops and spiritual fathers, and received an example from them. What sort of example did this people receive from their secular and spiritual leaders? The example of Theodulia, service to God as the meaning of life and the path to the heavenly kingdom. By taking note of the examples and actions of their double leaders, the Serbian people oriented themselves toward this knowledge in every aspect of their home life and society. When the Serbian Seljuk peasant sat and pondered at the edge of his hearth, whether in freedom or in bondage, he had to ask himself, if our kings and czars serve Christ our God, could I possibly find a better master to serve? If one must serve someone, then it is best to serve the best. If Nemanja, old and feeble, became a monk, why do I wait, and why do I not become a monk before inevitable death? And if Sava trampled over his youth like a cheap linen rag, and went off to the monastery, why should I prize my youth, which will wilt like a flower and wither like grass? And if our kings fasted and slept on straw mats like monks for the salvation of their souls, why should I seek lordship and pleasure when death stands outside the door? If our tsaristas and princesses withered and grew thin through their voluntary fasting in convents, shall I break the fast and stuff myself with rich foods? And if all the Serbian lords and rulers built churches and monasteries, why should I not light candles in these memorials that they founded? Why should I not contribute something and offer my own services in helping to build a church? And if all our great leaders of the state and the church conducted prayers to God in their homes, why should I not pray in my own home with my own children? On the basis of his own experience and the example set before his eyes, The Serbian household master in the mountainous countryside created something extraordinary with the help of God. He turned his home into a house of prayer, a church, a monastery, a holy mountain, and Jerusalem. He placed the cross of Christ on his home and sanctified everything with the cross and dedicated it to the most glorious and incomprehensible Holy Trinity. He took one of the glorified servants of God, a saint, as his patron and intercessor, and held services in his honor on the feast day, Krasnoslava. He introduced an abbreviated monastic typicon into his home, a typicon of prayer and fasting. The Serbian home became a true monastery, and with the one addition of a sanctified matrimonial bond for the sake of multiplying the people of God, and an abbreviated rule of prayer out of a necessity, but harder work made up for this: faith, honesty, obedience, and suffering. This, in brief, was the typicon of every Serbian home. What is the holy mountain of Athos except service to Christ our God? I cannot journey to the holy mountain, the Serb would say, therefore let my home become a holy mountain. What is this earthly Jerusalem in comparison with the heavenly Jerusalem? I would like to set out on a pilgrimage to the earthly Jerusalem, where my footsteps of my Savior are, but I cannot. Therefore I shall elevate myself to the Jerusalem on high, the greater Jerusalem, where not only his footsteps are, but even he himself, the resurrected and ascended vanquisher of death, my Lord and my God. Although every Serb was not in a position to make the journey to worship on the Holy Mountain or at Jerusalem, each was able to hike to the monasteries of his own land, the ecclesiastical foundations of his glorious czars, and every Serb did so. The Serbian peasant used to walk often and for long periods of time to visit these monasteries. He would make his confession, receive Holy Communion, elevate and unite his spirit with God. He used to struggle together with the monks, and just like the monks, he used to come to the monastery to see a son or a grandson who would be studying at the monastery and would also receive instruction himself. And he had much to learn there indeed. Monasteries were the best schools for the people that have ever existed among the Serbian people. The general tenets of Christianity and Serbian folk traditions were preserved there in all their fullness, both in the spirit of service to Christ our God. The Serb used to come to monasteries to see the most traditional and highly trained servants of God, and to be instructed by them to serve God and the saints of God. He would also come to hear how the saints of God, many of whom were his own Serbian ancestors, served God on earth through labor, prayer, continence, founding churches and monasteries, through suffering of every kind. Then he would return home, to pass on the instruction he had received to his own kindred, and apply it to his own home as to a little monastery. Orthodoxy is inconceivable without monasteries. Even the house of St. John the Theologian on Zion, where the Mother of God dwelled, was in reality, if not formally, a monastery. Here the apostles and the other faithful used to gather for the sake of prayer and instruction. And in that monastery the Mother of God was naturally the central figure, whom radiated her wisdom, faith, and exemplary life to all. It is especially impossible to conceive of Serbian orthodoxy without monasteries. In them the Serbian people were from time immemorial instructed in this rule of faith and the honor of humility, as well as their own great history. Every monastery used to remind the Serb of the ecclesiastical foundations of some Serbian ruler or noble. And the people began to realize how their great men had served God and their people, how they expended themselves and labored for their soul for the heavenly kingdom. Thus it was through the monasteries that the Serbian ancestors bequeathed to their descendants Theodulia, service to God. The Serbian clan was based on Theodulia, on service to God. If Theodulia weakened, the clan was undermined. The Serbian clan did not rest so much on blood, for blood mingles, as it did on Theodulia, i.e. on the acknowledgement that one must serve God with faith, honesty, suffering, and obedience. In the clan, everyone had his own honor and his own duty. The master of the household assumed the role of both ruler and clergyman. He was the primary and true Theodule, servant of God. As master of the house, he was, like Christ the Savior, the servant of all. He offered incense before the family icons, led the family in prayer, sprinkled all with holy water, cut the kalach on the slava, and raised it to the glory of God. Yes, in his own home, he was Moses and Aaron simultaneously, Sava and Stephen at the same time, a servant of the Lord in every aspect, all in his closely knit family domain. He loved all the members of his household, took care of them all, prayed to God for them all, helped them all, and was first to put his life on the line or lay it down for them all, just as some abbots of monasteries did. This is something truly rare in the history of Christianity. If Paisisie and Hadzi Diaruvim suffered death as abbots of their monasteries, so did thousands and thousands of Serbian household masters suffer the same for their domestic households. There are household monasteries as servants of Christ, and all join the assembly of their fathers in the great heavenly Serbia in the heavenly kingdom. By hard trials and frequent catastrophes, the Serb learned to remain silent and reflect deeply. This made his belief in destiny, Subda, even stronger. Each time the Serb reflected upon the past, he reached the conclusion it had to be that way. The righteous Lazar had to perish on the field of Kosovo because he chose the destiny of Christ and the kingdom of Christ. He had to die for the truth in order to be resurrected in glory. And he became glorified with unprecedented glory. He became a saint, both as a servant and as a martyr of Christ. He became the central heroic figure in the history of the Christian Balkans, from the Emperor Constantine to the present day. The despot George Brankovic had to suffer bitterly and to see his sons blinded and his daughter wedded to a Muslim. But this was the consequence of the sins of his father Vuk. The despot Stephen Visoki, Stephen the Tall, had to become a saint because he was the righteous son of the righteous Saint Lazar of Kosovo. There exists a course of justice and a course of injustice. Evil cannot produce good, nor can good be overcome by evil. For whatever is good has two homelands, earth and heaven. Deprived of the first, it moves to the second. And it has two homes on earth and in heaven. If its earthly home burns down, it moves into its heavenly home. Loss on earth is a gain in heaven. Derision on earth is glory in heaven. Suffering on earth is exaltation in heaven. Evil engenders swift retribution. Allow good to go downstream, and you'll find it if you go upstream. This is the just destiny that governs the world. The Serb arrived at this belief in destiny as a result of lengthy suffering, lengthy silence, lengthy reflection, lengthy trial and prayer. The highest form of drama is tragedy. The history of the Serbs is all tragic. The path of the Serbian people has led them along the edge of a sheer cliff above an abyss. Only a sleepwalker could travel this path without fear, for the horrors on that path are beyond number. Had the Serbs gazed down into the chasm over which they were walking, they would have become terrified and would have slipped and fallen. But they looked upwards, toward heaven, to God who ordains destiny, keeping their faith in Him. They kept up their pace, unconsciously or barely semi-consciously. Consequently, they succeeded in passing over the path along such a cliff as no Caucasian people has ever traversed to this day. Sometimes the Serbian people would lose their footing and begin to slide down, but they managed to climb back up onto the narrow trail on the precipitous ledge. The Serbian people knew that there was only one correct path, the path of their destiny and salvation. Some Serbs lost their footing, began to slide, and did not make it back up to the trail. They plunged to their deaths. But the majority of the Serbian people always managed to make it back to their path, the tragic path of suffering and resurrection, the path of Christ, with whom the Serbs had made a covenant of service. On this narrow path above the abyss, the Serbs had no theoretician or pragmatist to help them, no philosopher to speculate or surmise, and least of all, a scientist who knows everything afterwards but nothing beforehand. On this narrow path above the abyss, they were helped only by the one who had already passed over that path and could be a true and trustworthy guide on the terrifying path along which the Serbian people journeyed over the last 800 years. Their guide was Jesus Christ, the one who had come from the city towards which mankind was journeying, to point out the way, or more correctly, to be both the way and the guide on the way. From Adam to the ends of time and the limits of the universe, no one except he has come from there, from the unknown city, to point out the way and guide wayfarers to their destination, the heavenly city. The Serbian people, all wounded and bloody on this sleepwalker's precipice, understood this. Therefore they scorned all theorists, brushed aside all the philosophies and cynical sciences of the West, just like righteous Drasko brushed aside worm-eaten Venice, and cling to the hem of the robe of Christ the Lord as their only faithful guide. Both non-Christians and Christians suffer in this world. The question then arises, if pagans and atheists suffer, why do Christians suffer? Truly a great question which torments the souls of many of Christ's insecure followers. Nevertheless, even though the suffering of unbelievers and believers appears to be equal, the purpose and aim of the suffering is incomparably different. Consider a high forested mountain, rugged and steep, and on the peak of the mountain sits a radiant city. Round the mountain, in a circle, lies the road, wide and sparkling, which leads nowhere, for it goes in a circle. And now up the mountain on the edge of a cliff, a narrow trail leads to the city on the mountain top. Some wayfarers travel this broad circular road around the mountain without knowing why they are going or where they are going, without any hope of any better life at the end of the road, or of any sort of reward for their journey. The other wayfarers climb up that steep trail up the mountain, knowing why they are toiling and where they are headed. The first wayfarers are the pagans and atheists, sons of darkness in the earthly kingdom. And the second are the Christians, the children of light in the heavenly kingdom. And so they toil, but endure all their hardships with joy, for they know that they are journeying homeward to their eternal homeland, to the city of the Most High King, under the protective wing of their heavenly Father. And they know, moreover, that the hand of the Lord is helping them, and that their guardian angels are with them. This clear visionary knowledge encouraged the Serbian people throughout all the centuries of their torment and suffering. The Serbs did not learn the truth about life simply by listening to the gospel. They did not learn from books alone, rather they learned it through living experience as well. Many people have gone into a coma and have come out of it again and returned to life. Their souls left their bodies and, escorted by angels of God, journeyed through the world of souls and spirits. Here and there, such cases would occur in villages and cities, and the testimony of these witnesses always concurred. That world exists, a world of spirits of light, as well as a world of spirits of darkness. The righteous are in the world of radiant light and ineffable joy, while the winners and impenitent unrighteousness are in darkness and torment, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then, too, there were many apparitions from that world, especially during periods of national suffering. There were visions, both in dreams and in wakefulness, salvific visions, which confirmed all the truths of Christ's teachings. To people of simple and pure hearts, Christ himself appeared, and so did the Mother of God, angels of God, saints, and souls of deceased ancestors. Furthermore, news of the incidents which bore witness to the fact that God smites those who do evil and embraces those who do good traveled from village to village through the Serbian tradition of Moba, i.e., whenever the peasants would gather to help each other bring in the harvest or work in the fields. All this enormous oral tradition in which the Serbs, as a suffering and visionary people, are especially rich, could never have started up if a confirmation of Christ's teaching had not been so deeply engraved in every Serb's heart so universally. How terribly impoverished the Protestants are! who have no tradition. The destiny of all Orthodox people are generally similar to the destiny of Christ, but none to such a degree as the Serbian people. The great Russian peoples suffered, but not even a third as much as the Serbs. The Greeks also suffered, but much less so because they protected themselves through deception and making concessions. The cross of the Romanians and Bulgarians was incomparably lighter than that of the Serbs. In the Turkish Empire, the Serb millet was the most despised, likewise in Austro-Hungary. Why? Because the Serbs stood steadfastly for Christ and fought for the venerable cross. Because they gave their masters no peace, either alive or dead. For even the blood of dead Serbs used to cry out to God and torment the conscience of their oppressors. Oh, how often the dead are more terrifying to an enemy than the living. The Serbs did not end their struggle against the Turks on the field of Kosovo, nor even at the sieges of Smederevo or Belgrade. They never stopped fighting anywhere at any time, from Kosovo to Orsak, from Lazar to Karađorđe, or from Karađorđe to Kumanovo. Even after the fall of Smederevo and Belgrade, the struggle went on, dreadfully and persistently over the centuries, from Montenegro to Dalmatia, from Udbina, from Hungary, Romania, and Russia. Everywhere the cross-bearing Serb was the chief champion in the struggle against the Crescent to the bitter end. The glorious General Balkic defended Vienna from the Turks. In another battle, he led a German army against the Turks. The Yaksik clan amazed the Hungarians by their heroism in the struggle against the Turks, to the degree the Hungarian king Matthias called them the pillars of Christendom. Likewise, the Brankovic clan and others fought on in Romania and Bulgaria. The Smiljanic and Yankovic clans in Dalmatia, and not even to mention Montenegro, the eternal and impregnable bastion of Christendom against Islam. And all men will hate you for my name's sake, said the Savior to his apostles. And thus it naturally happened to the apostles, but it literally happened to the Serbs also, as the main bearers of the cross of Christ in the Balkans and in Austria. The infidel Turks and heretical Austrians hated the Serbs more than all the other peoples within their borders, and for the Serbs conditions grew worse and worse. And yet they had not looked up upon the destiny of Christ as their own. They would have never survived. But they saw in the suffering of Christ their own suffering, and in the death of Christ their own death, and in the resurrection of Christ their own resurrection, and vice versa. They believed that Christ himself was repeating his destiny through the Serbian people. This vision made their eternal suffering more bearable, and their perpetual slaughter easier to endure. For the Serbs, Christ was the very meaning of life and struggle, of suffering and dying, and freedom and restoration and work. He was the meaning of the church, the meaning of the state, the meaning of the family, the meaning of man. No people ever adorn the feast days of Christ with special touching customs as carefully and delicately as the Serbian people. Consider how they celebrate Christmas and Epiphany, Great Friday and Easter Ascension, and Great Friday and Easter, Ascension and Pentecost, Transfiguration, and Holy Cross Day. Everything is adorned with beautiful customs like a lovely and finely woven carpet. And the feast days of the Mother of God are adorned in like fashion. To no one in the heavenly world have the Serbs dedicated more churches to than the ever-Virgin Mary. The Serbs learned, moreover, to love and venerate the saints of God, especially the patron saints of their Krasnoslavas, truly as no one else in the world. To the soul of the Serb and the heavenly world was from time immemorial nearer and more present than the earthly world. He always saw more relatives in the heavenly world than in the earthly. Therefore, he always took great care to remember the dead, to light candles, to have their priests hold memorial services, pomens, for the repose of their soul. souls. And he prepared himself with service to Christ so that he himself might cross over to that higher world with faith, honor, virtue, and honor, and join his kindred before the face of Christ. Therefore, only there lies the great heavenly Serbia. Ah, that great heavenly Serbia. It symbolizes that great Serbia already realized long ago. We believe that there were well over 100 million baptized Serbs there, who during their earthly life served Christ or suffered for Christ over the centuries. For ages of ages, and more of them are there in the light of paradise, from periods of struggle, bondage, and suffering than from periods of freedom and easy living. Those who are more like Christ are closer to Christ in the heavenly world. We believe in accordance with the gospel that some peoples, far greater than the Serbian people on earth, will be lesser in the heavenly kingdom. Even the Lord himself said that the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And the suffering Lazarus shall shine among the first men in heaven, while the rich man shall sink among the last into the darkness of hell. The heavenly Serbia lies in paradise, as fragrant and beautiful as a rose in May. Here resides our holy fathers and forefathers, who attained their goal through the venerable cross. Here reside the Serbian Zupans, kings and czars, and the knights of the cross, both recent and ancient. Here the mothers of heroes and their sisters too, refined by suffering, shine as brightly as gold. Here the ranks of those who keep the fasts and meek saints live with a vast number of our dear relatives. Here venerable monks and nuns, pale through fasting, cheerfully behold the eternal light of God. Here live those who celebrate saints and found churches, strugglers and sufferers, both younger and older, sweet virgin maidens and tiny little children, who suffer as members of the flock of Christ, cut down by the sword, burned to death in tongues of fire, snapped off and blown down by the wind like tender twigs. Here are the household matters, who in their own home lit the vigil lights to the pre-eternal God, glorious master craftsmen, all skilled in their craft. All of them are there among the heavenly flock, prisoners from dungeons, patients from hospitals, the suffering, the poor, the downtrodden on earth, are rejoicing in kingdom around Saint Sava, as sons of the King in the glory of the King, the glorious Chetniks, the avengers of God, the many God-beseechers, many benefactors, widows in mourning, and mothers without children, all have found their place in heaven among God's saints. The peasant princes and those who rose up with them, and all of our other glorious ancestors, who lived in the most bitter and harshest of times, yet considered the impossible possible. Many generations of the very best stock, a people beyond number, the people of God. This is that eternal heavenly Serbia, which shines for God like a constellation of stars. God has given every man 2 fields of activity, for his household and for his neighbors. To every people there have likewise been given 2 spheres of activity and concern, for itself and for others. More is expected of one whom more has been given, i.e., more concern for himself and for others. Selfish people and people like that servant who received 1 talent and then buried it in the ground. God endowed the Serbian people with many talents, and for that reason he has also expected much from them. Destiny always expected 2 things from them: to put their own household in the best possible order, to help neighbors who had received fewer talents to put their household in order. The Serb fully accomplished both these tasks. He put his own household into a Christian home-like order, and then helped each and every other neighbor put his household in order, as St. Paul the Apostle said, "For if a man does not know how to care for his own household, how can he care for God's church?" Like a responsible household master, the Serb would paternally take care of his household, his people, and would likewise take care of his neighboring peoples, both near and far. Neither time nor distance prevented his service to Christ. On account of his bounteous and paternal spirit, St. Sava was beloved like an angel of God among the Hungarians and Bulgarians and among the Greeks and Arabs. King Milutin repulsed the Mongol invasion, not just from Serbia, but from the entire Balkans. Tsar Dushan waged war and suffered death in battle far from his own land for the sake of defending the Orthodox Greeks and Bulgarians, as much as for the sake of defending the Serbs. Prince Lazar perished on the field of Kosovo for the Venerable Cross and the freedom of all of Christendom, which all Europe sensed and recognized at the time. Karageorge rose up in rebellion with the ultimate aim of liberating all the Balkans and creating a Christian brotherhood of all the Orthodox peoples on the Balkan Peninsula.